Frank, I am so glad you shared your reaction when you received the invitation to speak on finishing well, because that was sort of my reaction. Am I more finished than I realize that I need to pay attention, especially to finishing well in life? So I'm up here with real humbleness. But I have to tell you, when I was in my 30s, I didn't even think about death very much. And the issue of finishing well in life, that wasn't even on my radar. But all that changed when I was 38, diagnosed with breast cancer, not once, but twice within 6 months. And after that second diagnosis, I was told I had 2% chance to be alive in 10 years. Here's a picture of my son during that time. He was 9 years old when I received that diagnosis. So I had to face the harsh reality that I had a 2% chance to see him graduate from high school. The next 10 years were really hard. I received chemotherapy, radiation, and an experimental bone marrow transplant that took me close to death. Kyle said to me years later, "Mom, you were a ghost in a shell during that time." I was extremely weak, and especially with the bone marrow transplant, that was really difficult. Here's a picture of me the day I found out I could go home from the bone marrow transplant. I'd been in an isolated hospital room for 5 weeks, and this was the day I found out my blood counts were high enough and I could go home to see Kyle. I was so excited. But going home was far from easy. I was extremely weak. I spent most of my days in bed. I couldn't do simple things like the laundry. And more than one day, my son felt all this responsibility to take care of me. And more than one day, he'd come home from school. He'd put a frying pan in my bed with a wooden spoon, and he'd say, "Hey, Mom, if you need me, I'm going downstairs to play Nintendo. Just hit the frying pan with a wooden spoon, and I'll be right up." He just told me recently when I was talking about speaking on this, he said, "You know, I woke up each morning wondering if you were still alive." It was a tough time, but cancer wasn't the only challenge we faced. I lost my job because I was too weak to return to work. My husband and I had been separated for months, and I went through a divorce. I can't tell you how many days I buried my head in my hands and said, "God, I can't do this. It is just too hard." I remember thinking dying would be easier than living. And I felt so hopeless, so helpless, and certain my life was never, ever going to get better. But I can tell you it was during that pain and suffering that I experienced Jesus in a real way. He was no longer up in the clouds somewhere. He was real, and he cared for Kyle and me. And so Kyle and I learned to lean on Jesus like we never learned before. And I'm here to tell you there is nothing like brokenness and pain to help us realize how present and powerful God can be. It's a life-transforming experience. He can take the most hopeless situations and turn it around. But in our case, it didn't happen overnight. It was one step at a time. Well, eventually, I did get to see Kyle graduate from high school. Here's his college graduation picture. Nobody was happier than I to be there that day. And then years later, I had the joy of dancing with him at his wedding. So now, many years have passed, now in my 60s. Several years ago, I was given the diagnosis of stage 4 lung cancer. And so again, I'm more aware than ever of the brevity of life. You know, our lives are short, and we need that wisdom to be aware of it and to live each day. We got to live well so that we can prepare to finish well, because we don't know when that'll happen. You don't need a terminal diagnosis to think about that. Well, in Proverbs 27:12, we read, "A prudent person foresees danger and takes precautions. The simpleton goes blindly on and suffers the consequences. For too many years, I was more like the simpleton, and it took for me a terminal diagnosis to wake up to the reality that life doesn't go on forever, and mine might be shorter than I thought. So I want to live the rest of my life, however long that is. I want to be intentional and responsible, to plan to live well, to prepare to finish well, and to press on throughout all the struggles and the difficulties that I'm going to face. Since none of us know that we're going to finish well for sure, we can't assume that we're going to finish well. And so we have to be aware. What are the dangers that can trip you up? What are the things you need to be aware of in your life? Here are three little ideas I'll share with you that have helped me stay on track and may be able to help you. First of all, plan to live within your limits. Cancer forced me to face my limitations. Since I've been in my 30s, I've had to face my physical limitations, my frailties. And I don't like being weak. I want to be strong, have stamina and endurance. But I've also learned the truth of what the Apostle Paul wrote. When we are weak, then we are strong, for God's power is made perfect in our weakness. But like Paul, I have struggled with those weaknesses and those limitations. 3 times he prayed for God to take the thorn away. And I have prayed many times for God to just take a lot of my limitations away. But I've had to learn, instead of being discouraged about what I can't do, I've had to learn to embrace them, because I've come to realize they're one way that God helps me focus only on the things he has called me to do, because I don't have all this energy to do all these other things. So I think living well to finish well means embracing our humanity, embracing whatever limitations you may have, whether it be physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, financial, but to accept those and live within our limits. Give yourself time to relax, time to rest and renew, time with family and friends. Because here's what I've learned the hard way. If you don't give yourself that time, plan that time, you will become dangerously depleted. And then you're more vulnerable than ever to discouragement, disappointments, and even depression. Which takes me to the next step. My next idea is, besides planning to live within our limits, prepare for the difficult times, the disappointments, because they will come. And so how are you going to deal with them? Are you ready to deal with them? For me, as a Christian, I want to do great things for God. And that's a good thing. But you know, sometimes I prepare and I plan and I pray, and nothing that I prayed for happens. Sometimes it gets worse. Maybe you have found that. Maybe that marriage that you hoped to keep intact ended in a divorce, or a child has become addicted to drugs, or you lost your job, or your church doesn't grow. Maybe that position you know you're more than qualified for is given to somebody else. And so what do we do in these difficult times? For me, for 9 years, I tried to find a publisher for my first book. Finally, I found a publisher. The book was written, but then a couple years later, the sales weren't that great. And so God and I had an honest conversation, because the problem is I never wanted to write a book in the first place, let alone take 10 years of my life doing it. So it was like, okay, God, what's going on here? I know you called me to write this book. What's wrong with me? Aren't you pleased with the book? Why do other people have these great sales and income? What's going on? Well, God was very clear that he hadn't called me to success. He called me to obedience, and I was obedient. And so preparing for the difficult times, those disappointing times, is to hold our visions, our dreams, the things we want to do for the Lord with an open hand and offer them to use as he sees fit. And what that means, sometimes you're going to grieve the loss of what you wish could be and no longer it is. And that could be a best-selling author or a pastor of a mega church. But we have to hold those lightly. And then the third point is we want to press on. Oh, forgot something. What I like about what Peter Scalera said is, you know, in these difficult times, and when your heart's broken, or things don't turn out, or you're feeling depressed, is to just cling to Christ as tightly as you can. Because it's in those tough times, those times of inconsolable pain, that you learn that God can change you, really transform you. And as Peter Scalera has said, only people deeply changed by Jesus will have a powerful, long-lasting, long-term impact on the world. And so the last point is then press on with God and the help of friends. And what I'm talking about here is family is critical, not crucial. I'm not saying don't press on with the help of your family, but I'm saying so often we miss the importance of having one or two close friends that we've learned over time we can trust, who are safe, who will care for us and support us, encourage us on those times we just simply want to give up and not go on. In January, I spoke to a group of women in leadership on the topic of friendship, and I was stunned afterwards how many women came up to me and said they didn't have one friend, one close friend. I don't know what I'd be besides my family and obviously God without my friends who encouraged me, supported me when I didn't think I could face another day. And it was that close relationship that counteracted all the sterile needles and the treatments I had to endure. So press in and, invest in friends that will help you get through the tough times. One of my closest friends, we have committed to each other to finishing well. And we have asked each other to point out when we're getting off track. She knows when I'm holding a resentment a little too tightly, or I'm getting spread too thin, and she'll gently call me on it. And the great thing is she knows what it's like to finish well, make the daily choices, because she watched her husband do it. He finished well. And so she can model that for me. And in turn, I want to model that for Kyle and others. So even though I can't say I've finished well yet, I can say I am fighting the good fight. I am living intentionally. And my prayer is that each one of us will plan on accepting and living within our limits, that we will be prepared for the difficult times, because they will come, but that we will press on with Christ, our family, and the help of our friends, so that one day, like the Apostle Paul, we can say, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith.